UFC champions are broke, some going as far as to having side jobs, and during the early days of the UFC, it was even worse than you can imagine, with the consensus flyweight GOAT, Mighty Mouse, fighting the consensus bantamweight GOAT, Dominic Cruz, for a grand total of $12,000. $12,000 to fight the greatest bantamweight of all time. We're going to dive deep into why UFC 301 represents everything wrong with the UFC, and why it encapsulates why so many champions are broke, and why so many fighters have to fight well past their prime, and what we're going to find out is that this has a negative impact on both superstars and lesser known fighters, and how it all compiles into fighters leaving for boxing and a massive influx of illegal streams. So let's get into it. And before we get along, with UFC 301 being here, my sponsor Underdog Fantasy wants to make it a lot more fun. Underdog Fantasy is the easiest place to play fantasy sports. Playing their pick'em game is as simple as selecting higher or lower on fighter stats like significant strikes, fight time, and fantasy points. You can make entries of all MMA picks or mix and match across your other favorite sports. You can win up to 100 times your money, and it's tons of fun. Underdog is available in 30 plus states, including Florida, California, Texas, and even Canada. Here are my picks for this weekend's fights, and new customers can pair that with Pantoja to go higher than one significant strike. All he has to do is have at least one strike to win that selection. Make sure you sign up with code Quiche to claim your special and deposit offer. That's Underdog Fantasy, promo code Quiche. Now let's get back to it. With UFC 301 coming after the god card that was UFC 300 that had literally everything you would ever want as an MMA fan, from big names to great fights to exciting knockouts to crazy commentary calls. It was everything we would ever want. So obviously UFC 301 was gonna be a hard follow-up and was most likely gonna be a lackluster card, and it is. And as MMA fans, we're greedy, but let's be honest, this is basically a fight night, if that. Now, I know as MMA hardcores, we're gonna look at the main card and be like, yeah, that's right. Like, we know a lot of the names there. Anthony Smith, Eeyore, Jose Aldo coming back, but there isn't anything that really jumps off the page. Jose Aldo coming out of retirement was somehow not a big deal in any capacity. Even the main event, which we'll get into later, doesn't make any sense, and everyone's looking at it like, why is this fight even happening? I don't know who thought that was a good idea, but it is what it is. So when you go through the whole card, there's no number one contender fight. None of the fights in the prelims stand out. Jose Aldo seemed like he was just brought in to make some sales, so at least they sell at the arena. Now, with the most exciting fight on the card being Michel Pereira versus Eeyore, the reality is that only hardcore fans are going to be really excited for this card. The reason this is so significant in the grand dark scheme of the UFC and champions being broke is because of how champions get paid. So I'm going to break this down as quick as possible. So when you're a UFC fighter, you have show money and then you have win money. So you essentially get half your purse if you lose. And then when you become a champion, you get something called pay-per-view points, which is a percentage of the pay-per-view sale. This is how champions really make that long-term money, because this percentage is huge, and the card you're on is obviously huge in terms of how much money you're actually going to get paid for your fight, and you don't know until after the fight how much the card sold in total. But the thing is, this wasn't always the case for flyweights particularly. Now, Pantoja might be getting pay-per-view points, but we'll get into why that's not that significant in a second. But the person I want to focus in on is Mighty Mouse, the UFC flyweight GOAT, and potentially the GOAT of the UFC in general. The reason I bring him up is because he is the only UFC champion in history to not get pay-per-view points for numbered UFC cards. His contract was a grand total of $125,000 for show money and then a $50K win bonus, which is absurd. The greatest flyweight of all time only getting $200K? No wonder they all have podcasts and make YouTube videos and have to do weird analyst gigs. It makes no sense that Mighty Mouse is not getting pay-per-view points. It's no wonder he left. It's no wonder him and Dana fought so much. And Dana White complaining that, oh, Mighty Mouse has the lowest recorded pay-per-view in history. Well, you might as well put him at a co-main event slot. But he didn't want to give him pay-per-view points, because then that champion is going to get a cut of the UFC's revenue. But with that being said, these champions that headline these cards like Pantoja, it isn't the UFC's fault that not every champion can be a superstar. But maybe it is. But before we get there, one way they can mitigate this for their champions, and so all parties, including themselves, can still get paid, is by having a good co-main event slot. This is normally in the form of a number one contender fight, Sean O'Malley, Colby Covington, someone else to perk it up that isn't getting pay-per-view points, but is boosting the overall sale of the pay-per-view in general. But there isn't that on this card, and Pantoja, who's reportedly only getting a few $100K to fight, being a champion, not having a good co-main event is huge, because he's barely going to make any significant money off this card. So another solution could be to have them in the co-main event slot of a Conor McGregor main event or a Nate Diaz main event. But the thing is, these fights make so much money for the UFC, and by putting a champion on those cards, they will be losing their own cut as well. So they don't want to put champions under a Conor and a huge superstar like a Dustin Justin card, because they're going to be losing money, and those champions are going to be making a ridiculous amount of money that in some ways they aren't really deserving of, because people aren't really buying the card for them, they're buying it for the main event. And that explains why UFC 302, which is going to be huge with Islam Makhachev and Dustin Poirier, doesn't have a champion in the co-main event slot, because everyone is only going to be buying that card for that fight. And then us hardcores like Sean Strickland and Paulo Costa, but Dustin Poirier and Islam have such huge appeal to casual audiences that putting a co-main event title slot isn't going to generate any more pay-per-view sales and only lead to the UFC losing a cut of the pay-per-view. And if you've been enjoying the video so far, if you could leave a like, I would really appreciate it, and let's get back to it. But it isn't all bad for the UFC, and they try and make it work in some regard, like with the Manchester card starting on US time. And now a lot of people are complaining about this, saying the fighters are going to be tired, they're fighting in the morning in the UK. You know who probably isn't going to be complaining about this? Tom Aspinall, because he's getting a cut of the UFC sale, and that means that the US audience is actually going to be able to buy the pay-per-view. And if you didn't know, a lot of times in Europe, these cards are for free, and if they're not for free, they're for a heavily reduced cost. So if you had a Europe start time, you're probably not even going to be making that many sales, because so many of them get the cards for free, and no one in the US is going to be buying the pay-per-view. So by starting it so early in the morning for the fighters, it's going to lead to the people getting pay-per-view cut to actually make some money, and that applies to both Leon and Tom, who should by all means be on the card. And the UFC also manipulates the markets, and UFC 300 encapsulates that perfectly with Bo Nickal as well as Wei Li. If you didn't know, there was a lot of discussion on Bo Nickal being on the main card and Yuri Prochazka being on the prelims. A lot of people were like, this doesn't really make any sense. Why is Bo Nickal, who's fighting some unknown guy, ahead of Yuri versus Rakic? Now the reason for that is Bo Nickal has a huge audience of people that don't watch the UFC, because he was the NCAA wrestling champion, I believe 3 times. And there's a lot of wrestling fans that only watch Bo Nickal fights and don't watch the rest of the UFC. So by putting Bo Nickal as the first fight on the main card, it caused a lot of fans that otherwise would not have bought the pay-per-view to end up buying it. And with Wei Li, who has a huge Chinese audience and a huge Asian audience all around the world, it's also causing an untapped market to then purchase the pay-per-view, which they otherwise wouldn't have. And of course, Wei Li's a champion as American fans, so the comparison isn't as clear there as it is with Bo Nickal, but I think you get the point. And as all these facts apply to Pantoja, this is probably going to be the worst pay-per-view of the year by far. No one knows who he's fighting, people barely know him, and his countdown is one of the worst performing countdowns in the history of the UFC, and the UFC has done nothing to help stack up this fight, because a lot of the names on this card are people that hardcore fans don't even like. Hardcore fans hate Anthony Smith, and what makes matters worse is when you know Pantoja's history. Before he got the belt, Pantoja was both a fighter and a part-time Uber driver. Pantoja, who has been a ranked flyweight for so long, had to drive Uber. And I know so many fans are sitting there like, you should only get paid how much you bring in. But for a ranked fighter to be an Uber driver while fighting in the UFC, the greatest promotion on earth, is absolutely insane. And the fact that all of these fighters have different gigs, from appearing on shows to having podcasts, having YouTube channels, to doing the analysis desk, they all actually need more money. And I know the topic of UFC pay is huge, and just breaking down 301, I'm sure some people in the card are probably getting 12k shows, 12k win, which is absolutely ridiculous. But it's no surprise that as they fight out their contract, they eventually want to test out other promotions, because other promotions are probably willing to overpay them a lot, because they're getting ex-UFC fighters and they can promote it, and those promotions are really looking to sell tickets on a more localized level. So stuff like bare knuckle and these smaller boxing promotions, these jiu-jitsu tournaments, karate combat, these ex-UFC fighters are way more valuable to them than being an unknown fighter in the UFC. It also makes sense why they're all trying to go boxing and influencer boxing, because boxing is way easier for them and they're making way more money. And Pantoja did do it to himself in some regard, because he basically said that he was going to fight on this card regardless, and he was going to fight anyone. But this is crazy. And one of the reasons even hardcore fans aren't willing to buy it is the price point keeps on rising. I believe it is now at almost $90 when you include the ESPN Plus subscription that you need to buy, and no one nobody is going to pay $90 for this card. I bet if you ask Dana White himself, he wouldn't pay $90 for this card. So all of that has led into an increase of streaming, and this affects superstars, this affects the whole promotion, because these crappy cards have been going on for a long time, and the UFC fan base has all acclimated to streaming. From old people to young fans, all of them are hip to streaming and illegally watching these fights, and it's made it that now when there even is an okay card or a good card, people will still opt for streaming. And I think it's made it really hard to identify who is a pay-per-view superstar, because when you look at Sean O'Malley, his pay-per-view sales don't exactly jump out the page, but when you go online and you see the relevance on social media, you know he is a superstar, and you know that so many people are streaming his fights. Now, what is the solution to this? Is it holding out fighters so you could build up better cards, so you're not stacking up one card and you can distribute the wealth, or is it having more fighters that helps you spread it out more? But I think one of the big issues is the really bad fight nights. The UFC wanting to put on events every week has led to these fight night main events being pretty bad, but they would have been good on a main card of a pay-per-view, except now they're stuck as the main event of a fight night, and they're really stripping the wealth off these pay-per-views in general and making it so that every card is being hurt from it. Now only every few months do we get a banger of a card. I know this is all ironic coming off UFC 300 and with 302 being announced, but it is relevant, and I think it shows that the UFC is having a really hard time building up fighters. Most of the superstars that have come from either their fights or them being a superstar outside the UFC, like Patty and Conor. I think the UFC is struggling on the YouTube department and a lot of the interviews and really building up these fighters. Do you think Pantoja got screwed over here? And do you think the UFC will ever figure out how to build up fighters better and make it so these cards don't suck? So if you enjoyed this video, why don't you check out this one on if losing destroys a fighter's legacy, and leave a like, subscribe, and don't forget, we're just getting started, we're gonna stay consistent, and I'll see you in the next video.